Hello, Year 9. I hope you're doing okay during lockdown. We all hope to see you back face to face soon, but in the meantime, I thought we might do something a little bit different for the optional extension activity this week. The Battle of Gallipoli has a very important place in Australian culture. Even though it took place over 100 years ago in a quite obscure part of the world, it has been argued that it's the closest thing our country has to a national religious holiday. I, like you guys, had learned about Gallipoli in Year 9. I've got some hazy recollections of learning about trenches, jam tin bombs, bully beef, Simpson's donkey, careless British commanders, brave Aussie diggers, and even one lesson where a substitute teacher showed us First World War bayonet drill using a mop. Maybe thanks to Anzac Day, I'd always imagined Gallipoli as one of, if not the most significant event in Australian history. However, like lots of people, I had very little understanding of how it all fit together. My view was as much thanks to movies and Anzac culture as it was to actual history. A few years ago, I got an opportunity to travel to Turkey, and during this time, I managed to spend a couple of days exploring the battlefields of the Gallipoli campaign. Now, historian James Holland says that there is nothing like walking the ground to help you understand the history of a battle. And when the world opens back up, if you have an opportunity to visit any historical site, I really urge you to do so. You won't regret it. Now, while we would love to be able to take you all off for a school trip to Turkey, the next best thing to do is a virtual site study. So I've put together a short series of videos to help you understand the background, events, and impact of the Gallipoli campaign. Your job while watching this is to take down any notes you think are important, but really just to be able to get your head around the Gallipoli campaign. This video is going to deal with the first phase that most people really haven't heard of. So, without further ado, what would become the Battle of Gallipoli really began in the horror of the Western Front. We'll be learning about this in the mandatory work coming in the next couple of weeks, but for now, it's enough to understand that by the end of 1914, the front lines between the Germans and the Allied powers in France had stopped moving. From the Swiss border in the south to the North Sea, a long, dirty scar of trenches, barbed wire, bodies, and muddy shell holes stretched. Between 1914 and the end of the war, this line would move very little, despite immense battles that swallowed millions of lives for very, very little gain. Now, one of the questions everyone asks about the war is why did they continue to launch these pointless attacks? Well, it's really easy to generalize all the commanders and generals as a bunch of ignorant fools who sat in French chateaus, safe behind the line, sipping champagne while their men were mowed down. It's a real oversimplification. While there were a few butchers and fools, most of the commanders on all sides were trained professionals who had experienced war before. They knew the futility of throwing thousands of men at lines of barbed wire and machine guns. Now, one of the oldest rules of military tactics is to attack where you are strongest and your enemy's weakest. This has usually been one side of an enemy army, a thing known as a flank. The problem in December 1914 was that, on the Western Front at least, there was no weak spot, there was no flank. To find a weak spot in the Central Powers lines, the Allies would have to look to the entire borders of Europe and Asia, to the weakest of Germany's allies, the Ottoman Empire. Now, the plan for Gallipoli was the brainchild of the head of the Royal Navy, First Sea Lord of the Admiralty, Winston Spencer Churchill, and the most famous sailor and highest-ranking naval officer in Britain, you can see there on the right, which is Admiral Jackie Fisher. Now, the Navy had spent most of the war until now in a staring contest with the German High Seas Fleet across the Grey North Sea. Churchill was always a bit of a maverick thinker. It would really serve him well in the Second World War, but probably not so much in the First. He liked to find new and innovative solutions to problems. While the Royal Navy had the greatest new dreadnoughts and battleships, they, along with their French allies, also had lots of older ships that wouldn't stand up in a battle with the best the Germans had, their high seas fleet. Now, the problem started with the fact that Churchill really loved history, and he'd read lots of exploits of a British fleet that about 100 years before him in the wars against Napoleon. Acting with reckless speed, the commander, a guy called Duckworth, had led a really small British fleet through the narrows of this part of the world called the Dardanelles, and right up to the capital of the Ottoman Empire, a city called Constantinople. With his guns trained on the Ottoman Topkapi Palace and the government buildings, the British had been able to dictate some terms to the Ottoman Sultan. So I'm sure you're seeing what Churchill is thinking. The Allies had a bunch of old ships sitting around, costing money, not contributing to the war effort in any way. Now, what if they tried to repeat the exploits of the Napoleonic Wars? They could knock the Ottomans out of the war and open another front against Germany's next weakest allies, the Bulgarians. Then link up with the Romanians, take out the Austro-Hungarians, and then into the Germans, and the war's over. This is the strategic flank that the Allies were looking for. You can see on the map that the Dardanelles, part of modern-day Turkey. Now, we all know how Gallipoli turned out, but does that mean it was a bad plan? Maybe. Well, it's not really surprising that the amateur Churchill, who'd had no military experience before this at all, apart from charging around in North Africa on the back of a horse, the fact that he didn't take into account changes in naval technology since Napoleon's wars, not really surprising. What is surprising is that neither Fisher, who joined the Navy at the age of 13 and had served all the way through, nor any other professional naval commander in the Royal Navy pointed this out. Now, you can see in this picture here just how vulnerable the Ottoman capital was. To the left, where you see that little tower, that's the Asian continent. To the right, that's the modern city of Istanbul, perched on the European shore. See those domes and towers there? That is the Topkapi Palace, the ancient seat. Now we'll zoom in a little bit. The ancient seat of the Ottoman Sultans, the leaders of the Ottoman Empire, and the Sublime Porte, what kind of sort of passed for government in the Ottoman Empire. Now, if Churchill had managed to get even one battleship through the Straits, it is possible that the plan might have worked. But I guess we'll just never know. Here you can see a map of the Dardanelles, so it's just to the right of this. See the narrowest part? This is called, imaginatively, the Narrows. It's around about 700 metres across. Lots of people in ancient times had swum across it and modern times. Now, Churchill was informed that the Ottomans were not, in fact, idiots, and that they had prepared defences for the Dardanelles using heavy artillery and fortified shore batteries. Ones like this here. And here, this is a reconstructed one that's still there. Here's a picture of one of these shore batteries. This is no problem to Churchill. Churchill said he happened to have enrolled around about 10,000 reserve sailors who didn't have any ships into a special amphibious landing force. These are kind of like the commandos before the commandos of World War II. He called them the Royal Naval Division. Now, Allied battleships could silence the batteries with gunfire, while groups of naval division troops could be landed and overwhelm these Turkish shore batteries from the land if needed as the fleet sails through the Narrows. Besides, Churchill argued that the whole point of the plan was that these ships were expendable, they were useless, and if a few got lost during the attack, then that's no great loss. Knocking the Ottomans out of the war was the main goal. At this stage of the war, the Royal Navy was building around about 600 new ships every year, so a handful of ships being lost is not really here or there. Now, this plan all depended on speed and surprise. The attack would take place with neither of these things. Now, while Churchill and Fisher sat back in London at the Admiralty building, command of the actual fleet in the battle went to this bloke here on the left with the killer moustache. This is Admiral Sackville Carden. Now, from early 1915, Allied ships started to appear near the mouth of the Dardanelles, fire a couple of shots on the batteries, and then kind of disappear off over the horizon. Sackville called this probing the defences, but all it really did was it gave the Ottomans and their German allies a bit of a warning that something was coming, and it gave them time to start getting ready for that. Now, one of the things that they started doing was laying these things. You might have seen them in Finding Nemo. These are sea mines, and were a pretty new invention at the start of World War I. While shore batteries needed lots of hits on one battleship, or a particularly lucky shot to damage or even kill a battleship, a sea mine could sink the most powerful dreadnought of the time with just one hit. Now, Allied seaplanes flying from these Allied battleships about 15 kilometres offshore had discovered the minefields. They could see them because the water's really clear. And so the Allies had bought a few small fishing trawlers with them to kind of get rid of these mines, clearing a path through the first 5 minefields. And then the main fleet would attack on the 18th of March. And then those little trawlers that looked a little bit like this is one of them, a little fishing boat, would sail through the middle of this battle and very slowly and meticulously clear the second of these 5 minefields. There are 2 problems with this plan. The first is that these minesweepers are fishing trawlers, so they're made of wood. Wood tends to not stop artillery shells or even machine gun fire. They're very, very vulnerable. The second thing is that every night, as the minesweepers are going in and trying to clear away some of these mines, the Turkish mine-laying ships would just go out and replace any mines that have been cleared up during the day. Now, 2 days before the battle, before the 18th of March, Admiral Sackville-Carden came down with the flu really, really badly and said he just couldn't continue as commander of the Allied fleet anymore. He was replaced by this bloke who is second from the right here. This is Admiral John de Robeck. Now, to the left of him is General Sir Ian Hamilton, who we'll talk about lots in the future. He's going to be the commander of the ground troops in Gallipoli. But remember, at this stage, there's no plan to go on the ground. Now, Robeck wasn't overly keen on this plan. He thought it was a little bit rubbish, and he told everyone that he wasn't confident that the attack would succeed, but that they've got to go ahead anyway, because that's what their orders were. I'm sure you can imagine how good for morale that was. In any case, none of this really mattered, because the battle was decided by this little Turkish ship, which is actually still around. You can go and see it over in Turkey. This is called the Nusret. Now, the Turks had noticed that each time the Allies sailed in close to shore to fire on the batteries, they followed the same path. The night before the main attack on the 18th, the Nusret sailed out to the mouth of the Dardanelles, and the commander of this ship and his crew of 15 guys, the commander was a guy called Hakkab Bey, and they laid 26 mines in this path, mines that the Allies had no idea were there. And you can see them just down to the bottom, that red line there. Okay, 11 a.m. the next day, the Allied attack begins. 18 battleships, 297 guns. Each one of those guns was firing a shell that weighed around about 700 kilograms and was packed full of high explosives. So they start moving into the Dardanelles in 3 great lines, opening fire from as far as 8.5 kilometers away. That's actually just beyond the curve of the Earth. At 1 p.m., they start to move really cautiously into the Dardanelles itself. They're dueling with shore batteries as they went. De Robeck ordered the second line to advance while the first is covering them with their fire. They've got to go up to those narrows, remember a couple of slides back. And as the 8 vessels of the second line followed the usual path, they start to take serious damage from shore battery fire. This is the French battleship Bouvet. At 1:45, the French battleship Bouvet was hit by a mine and sank within 3 minutes. It's very, very quick. Had 758 men on this ship, and everyone except for 48 went down with it. A German officer who happened to be in one of the shore batteries took these photos here. You can see the Bouvet sailing, and then it's tipping to the side. He took it as it was sinking, so it's pretty rare in World War I we get these kinds of things, because photography was a relatively new invention. At 4 p.m., HMS Inflexible, another battleship, hit a mine and began to sink as the crew abandoned ship. This didn't go down as quickly. It was taking on water and was kind of leaning over to one side. You can see a little boat of men being pulled off. It was towed out to sea, and then they beached it on a nearby island so it wouldn't sink. Everyone managed to get off that one, apart from around about 100 men who were killed during that first attack. Shortly after that, HMS Irresistible, which you can see here, struck a mine and started to sink, again, slowly listing to her side. As darkness fell, de Robeck ordered the ship to be towed back out to sea by another battleship, the HMS Ocean. Here's the HMS Ocean here. As Ocean turned to tow Irresistible, they started throwing ropes over. A gigantic explosion shook the sea. Ocean leaned violently over to her side, spewing fire and smoke. Alerted by this explosion, the Turkish shore batteries are now going to open fire on it, damaging her rudder. So all she can do now is sail in circles under the fire of the Turkish guns. Now, for 2 hours, two of these destroyers, these much smaller ships, under a guy called Commodore Roger Keyes, they sailed in very, very close. And while this fire is coming down on them, over that 2 hours, they take all the crew off both of these ships, and they sail right back out to where the main fleet has kind of rallied after this bit of a defeat at the mouth of the Dardanelles, about 10 kilometers offshore. Now, when they get back out, de Robeck orders Keyes to go straight back in and find these abandoned battleships now that night has fully fallen and drag them back out to sea. Keyes goes in there and spends 4 hours sailing backwards and forwards, and he can't find anything of these two battleships. They've sunk beneath the waves. Now, for the Ottomans, here's a picture of Keyes here. In World War II, Keyes goes on to command all the kind of the special forces of the British Empire. So he's a bit of a scoundrel, didn't really like wearing the uniform properly and getting himself in trouble a lot. He wrote lots about this battle, and not much of it good. Now, for the Turks, they'd lost 118 men during this attack. They'd managed to sink 3 Allied battleships, and they'd severely damaged another 3. There were another 8 ships that had suffered some kind of damage. This is the greatest loss suffered by the Royal Navy since the Napoleonic Wars, since 1805. That night, Keyes writes in his diary when he gets back, finally about 3 o'clock in the morning, back to safety. He goes into his cabin and writes down, "I was certain we were defeated against a defeated enemy. At 2 p.m. in the afternoon, I thought maybe we were being defeated. After 4, I knew that we had lost." Now, despite this, there's panic in the Ottoman capital. And here's the Ottoman capital as it looked in 1915. And here is the same part of the Ottoman capital when I was there in 2015. Now, the thing that the British didn't know is that the Ottomans were running out of ammunition. The Turkish defences could only hold out for another 2 to 3 hours. The US ambassador, who was in Constantinople at the time, a guy called Henry Morgenthau, wrote that they fully expected the attacks to resume in the morning of the 19th. And he claimed that everyone was planning for the capital to fall, and that if the capital fell, the Ottoman state would collapse overnight. Arguments really still rage over whether the Ottoman defences were really that bad. Were they running out of ammunition? Would another attack have kind of broken through and achieved what was going on? We do need to remember there were another 5 lines of sea mines, and that of all the ships that had sunk, almost all of them were sunk because of mines. Regardless, as the day dawned on the 19th, no attack came, nor would one. De Robeck fully expected to be fired for his failure, and he wrote in his diary on the night of the 18th, "After losing so many ships, I shall obviously find myself superseded tomorrow morning." He wasn't. There were lots of furious telegraphs coming, telegraphs kind of like a text message from World War I. They were coming from London, particularly from Churchill. Churchill was furious, claiming that this is part of the plan. They were supposed to lose ships. It didn't really matter. But by the time all of this has happened, this is the 20th. It's too little, too late. The Ottomans had had time to rebuild and reinforce their defences. They laid even more mines. There's now about 15 mine belts in there. And the opportunity, if there ever was one, was lost. The British started looking around for any ground troops in the area which were close to hand. They knew they had the Royal Naval Division, but they needed more than that. They thought that maybe if they could attack the Gallipoli Peninsula, capture those shore batteries, then they could send their ships up through the Dardanelles off to Constantinople and achieve their aim that way. So they started casting about for anything they could see. Found there were a whole bunch of British colonial troops. There were some French. There were some colonial Senegalese troops. Oh, and look, down in Egypt, there's 10,000 fresh Australian and New Zealanders who are on their way to Western Europe. The Australian and New Zealand Army Corps, ANZAC, they should do the trick. More on that next week. All right, well, I hope this was informative. Let me know what you think of this week's activity. Was it worthwhile? Any ideas about suggestions to make it better? I hope it's been informative and it's helped make this kind of forgotten part of the Gallipoli campaign a little bit clearer. Next week, we'll look at how a failed plan goes from bad to worse. when the Allies forget one of the basic rules of military strategy and reinforce a defeat in a big way. They start landing troops and they find out that, to their surprise, Turkish soldiers are not just going to run away and give up.